But there's nothing like being slotted between Sir Martin and Sir Ken to make a guy feel like an underachiever. So what I want to say, so that the AV team doesn't kill me, what you are about to hear is not the sound of the audio system malfunctioning. Okay, so that may sound a little bit like a horror movie soundtrack, but it is in fact one of the great artifacts in our collective ingenuity. That is the first known, the earliest known audio recording in human history. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, you know, Thomas Edison invented the phonograph, 1877. You know, I know this story. In fact, that recording is from 1860, using a device called the phonograph that was patented in France in 1857 by a genius inventor named Edward Léon Scott de Martinville, when Thomas Edison was 10 years old, a full 20 years before Edison started to work on the phonograph. And it was an ingenious device. It basically took in sound waves through a kind of a membrane covered with parchment that would vibrate, modeled after the anatomy of the human ear, and would convert those vibrations into vibrations in a little pig bristle that would etch waveforms onto a rotating cylinder. It was just an ingenious invention. It's very unusual, particularly in 19th century technology, to be almost a full generation ahead of the competition in something like that. When you're 20 years ahead of Edison, you're doing pretty well, right? So the question is, why have we never heard of this guy? And the answer is, and this is where the story gets really interesting, that Scott managed to forget one key feature: playback. There was no way to actually listen to the audio that you recorded. Now, this may seem a bit odd. It's a little bit like inventing the automobile and forgetting to include the part where the wheels turn around. Or, you know, there's a reason why when they rolled out the iPod, they didn't forget to include a headphone jack, right? You know, it's like it's got 1,000 songs in your pocket, you just can't listen to them. It's just nice to know they're there. That wouldn't have done quite so well, right? And so what's fascinating about it is that Scott didn't just forget to include this feature, or he wasn't just kind of struggling to invent this feature and get playback. It never even occurred to him. It wasn't part of kind of his frame of possibilities. He didn't even try to invent playback, something that seems so obvious to us today. And the question is, why would you even do that? Why would you invent something to record audio that you couldn't play back? Well, his idea was he was obsessed with sonography. And he'd seen this success of creating little markings on a page that could take a transcript of what somebody was saying, and you could learn to read them back. And he thought if he could transcribe sound waves onto a cylinder, human beings, who turned out to be quite good at, you know, deciphering patterns written onto a page, human beings would learn to read waveforms, and it would be like an ultra-fast form of transcription. It was actually a pretty good bet. It just turns out that human beings don't have in their cognitive toolkit the ability to read sound waves. None of us can do it even to this day. But a wonderful thing about 10 years ago, a group with this wonderful organization called firstsounds.org, led by people like David Giovanni, found these old etchings of waveforms in these archives in Paris. And they took them and they scanned them into a computer. And they trained the computer basically to play them back and convert them into audio. And so 150 years later, they heard the sound of Edward Léon Scott de Martinville warbling from the grave, what you just heard there. It's a wonderful kind of bringing back to life of this technology. But I bring this up and tell you this because I think there's an important lesson here, particularly in a context like TED, which is that when we study the history of innovation, or we look around us and at all the innovators around us and in this room, we so often focus on the breakthroughs and the successes and the ideas worth spreading. But if you look at the history of innovation, it is almost as often defined by these blind spots, these empty spaces, the thing that seems so obvious 10 years from now that you couldn't think of at the time, that wasn't in your field of vision. So I think it's important for all of us as individuals or as organizations to go back, take an inventory of your past 10 years. What was the thing you couldn't see? And what kept you from seeing it? And try and figure out what those blind spots were, because if we get good at that and we learn from the patterns of those older blind spots, we can start to anticipate the things we're not seeing now, because I guarantee you they're out there. And by the way, not every blind spot is a dead end. Scott never saw a penny from his invention and is largely forgotten from history, but about 15 years later, another inventor was tinkering with the phonograph and hit upon a new way to capture and transmit sound. And that guy's name was Alexander Graham Bell. Thank you very much.